The bullet that shattered 17-year-old Lily Mae Carson's world didn't come from an outlaw's gun or a cavalry rifle. It came from the realization that the man who'd called himself her father for 10 years had sold her like livestock to pay his gambling debts. And the Cherokee half-breed, who'd just outbid 3 drunk cowboys for her ownership, was now her only hope of survival in the unforgiving wilderness of 1878 Colorado Territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's voice cut through the tobacco smoke and whiskey, stench of Deadwood Pete's saloon, like a rusty blade through flesh, each word driving deeper into Lily Mae Carson's chest until she could barely breathe. She stood on the makeshift platform in the corner of the saloon, her wrists bound with coarse rope, her cotton dress torn at the shoulder from when she'd tried to run 3 hours earlier. The men below her bid on her future with the same casual interest they'd shown for the stolen horses and cattle that had been auctioned before her. 17 years old, strong as a mule, and pretty enough to keep a man warm through winter, Pete hollered, his gold tooth glinting in the lamplight as he gestured toward Lily Mae like she was prime breeding stock. "What am I bid for this fine specimen of frontier womanhood?" The words hit Lily Mae like physical blows, each syllable a reminder that she was no longer a person with a name and dreams and fears. She was merchandise to be sold to the highest bidder. She kept her chin raised, despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, her green eyes scanning the crowd of leering faces below. 3 cowboys from the Silver Dollar Ranch had been drinking steadily for hours, their bids growing more aggressive with each shot of rot-gut whiskey. A traveling merchant with soft hands and cruel eyes had joined the bidding, his smile promising things that made Lily Mae's stomach turn. And in the back corner, barely visible in the shadows, stood a man who hadn't spoken a word since entering the saloon an hour ago. The silent man was tall and lean, with bronze skin that spoke of Cherokee blood and dark hair that hung past his shoulders despite the white man's clothes he wore. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with the kind of scars that came from living hard in hard country. But it was his eyes that caught Lily Mae's attention. They were the darkest brown she'd ever seen, and unlike every other man in the saloon, they looked at her with something that might have been respect instead of hunger. $40, called out Jake Morrison, the loudest of the Silver Dollar Cowboys, his words slurred by drink and meanness. "And I'll throw in another 10 if she can cook as good as she looks." The crowd laughed at his crude joke, but Lily Mae noticed the Cherokee man's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He remained silent, but his dark eyes never left her face, as if he were seeing something the other men missed entirely. $50, countered the merchant, adjusting his spectacles with fingers that had never done an honest day's work. A girl like that would be quite the asset to a man of business. The way he said asset made Lily Mae's skin crawl. She'd heard enough whispered conversations among the saloon girls to know what kind of business he was thinking about, and the knowledge made her want to scrub her skin raw just from his gaze. This wasn't supposed to be her life. 10 years ago, when Thomas Carson had found her half dead beside the burned-out wagon that had held her real family, she'd thought she was being rescued. He'd told everyone in Silver Creek that he was taking in a poor orphan child out of Christian charity, and for a while, Lily Mae had believed she'd found a father who would protect her and care for her like his own blood. She'd worked his small ranch without complaint, cooking his meals and mending his clothes, and never asking for anything more than a kind word or a moment of approval that never seemed to come. But Thomas Carson's kindness had been as fragile as morning frost, disappearing the moment it became inconvenient. His gambling debts had mounted over the years, and when the men he owed money to came calling with guns on their hips and patience worn thin, he'd made a choice that revealed exactly what Lily Mae had always meant to him, nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded when it suited his purposes. "I raised you for 10 years. he told her that morning, as he'd loaded her into the wagon like cargo, his bloodshot eyes refusing to meet hers. Fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head when nobody else would. You owe me this much. The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical wound could have. Not because she'd expected better from Thomas Carson. She'd long since learned not to expect tenderness from a man who gave it so grudgingly, but because it forced her to acknowledge what she'd always feared was true. She was truly alone in the world, with no one to protect her and nowhere to run, where desperate men wouldn't eventually find her. $60, Jake Morrison called out, his bid accompanied by a long look that made Lily May want to wrap her arms around herself for protection. I guarantee she'll earn every penny back before the month's out. More laughter from the crowd, coarse and ugly, like the baying of wolves circling wounded prey. Lily May closed her eyes briefly, trying to remember what her real father's voice had sounded like before the Apache attack that had destroyed her first family. She'd been only 7 when it happened, but she could still recall fragments, the way he'd called her Little Sparrow, because she was always humming while she worked, the gentle strength of his hands when he'd lifted her onto his shoulders. To see over the crowd at the 4th of July celebration in their old town. Those memories felt like someone else's life now, as distant and impossible as the stories in the books she used to read before Thomas Carson decided that education was a waste of time for a girl who'd never amount to anything anyway. $75, the merchant said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of a man who wasn't accustomed to being outbid by common cowboys. Final offer. Pete the auctioneer looked around the saloon, his greedy eyes searching for one more bid that would line his pockets a little deeper. $75 for this prime piece of frontier femininity. Do I hear 80? $80 for a girl who'll cook your meals and warm your bed and never give you a lick of trouble. The silence stretched out like a held breath, broken only by the sound of men shifting in their chairs and the distant piano music drifting in from the main barroom. Lily May felt her fate settling around her shoulders like a shroud, heavy and inescapable. In a few moments, she'd belong to a man who saw her as nothing more than property to be used until she broke or died or simply wore out from the weight of living without hope. That's when the Cherokee man stepped forward from the shadows. His boots made no sound on the saloon's dirty floor, but somehow his presence filled the room like thunder rolling across empty plains. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to walk silently through hostile territory, every step deliberate and controlled. When he reached the front of the crowd, he looked up at Lily May for a long moment, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. $100, he said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent saloon despite its soft tone. Cash. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and speculation through the crowd of drunken men. Jake Morrison's face flushed red with anger and alcohol, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Now hold on there, breed," he snarled, using the word like a weapon designed to cut and wound. "Just because you got some money don't mean you got the right to outbid decent white folks." The Cherokee man turned his head slowly toward Morrison, and Lily May saw something dangerous flicker in those dark eyes. Not anger exactly, but the kind of cold patience that belonged to predators who knew how to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. "My money spends the same as yours," he said calmly, reaching into his jacket to pull out a roll of bills that made several men in the crowd whistle low under their breath. "Unless Pete here is running the kind of auction where the color of a man's skin matters more than the color of his money." Pete the auctioneer looked back and forth between the Cherokee man's cash and Morrison's reddening face, his own features twisted by the kind of greed that always won out over prejudice when the stakes were high enough. "Well now," he said carefully, "money's money, I always say, and $100 is more than I've seen in this saloon since Christmas." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "This ain't right," the merchant protested, his soft hands clenching into ineffective fists. "A half-breed. Savage buying a white girl. It's unnatural. It's business," the Cherokee man interrupted, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge that made the merchant take an involuntary step backward. "You had your chance to bid higher. You chose not to." He counted out the bills slowly, each one crisp and new, placing them on the bar with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this before, not buying people perhaps, but negotiating. Deals where every detail mattered, and one wrong word could mean the difference between success and disaster. Lily May watched this exchange from her position on the platform, her mind reeling as she tried to understand what was happening. She'd expected to be sold to one of the leering cowboys, or the predatory merchant had steeled herself for a future that would be measured in pain and degradation. But this silent Cherokee man was a complete unknown, and somehow that was both terrifying and strangely comforting at the same time. $100 it is, Pete announced, scooping up the money with hands that shook slightly from excitement. "Sold to the gentleman in the back. She's all yours, friend." The Cherokee man nodded once, then looked up at Lily May again. For a moment their eyes met across the smoky saloon, and she saw something in his gaze that she couldn't quite identify. Not ownership or lust, or the casual cruelty she'd grown accustomed to seeing in men's faces. It was something quieter and more complex, like recognition or perhaps even regret. "Come down," he said simply, extending one calloused hand toward her. Lily May hesitated, her bound wrists making it difficult to maintain her balance on the makeshift platform. She'd spent the last 3 hours trying to imagine what her new owner would be like, had prepared herself for rough hands and rougher words, for being grabbed and manhandled like the piece of property she'd legally become. But the Cherokee man waited patiently for her to make her own way down the steps, his hand offered for support rather than demanding compliance. When she finally placed her fingers in his palm, his grip was firm but gentle, steadying her as she stepped down onto the saloon floor. His skin was warm and roughened by years of hard work, but his touch held none of the aggressive possessiveness she'd expected. Instead, he helped her down with the same careful courtesy he might have shown a lady stepping down from a fancy carriage, as if her current circumstances didn't define who she was or how she deserved to be treated. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the grumbling of the disappointed bidders behind them. The question caught her off guard. In the 3 hours since Thomas Carson had delivered her to Pete's auction, no one had bothered to ask her name. She'd been the girl, or the merchandise, or simply it, as if giving her a name might make the men bidding on her remember that she was a human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams that were being crushed under the weight of their casual cruelty. "Lily May," she whispered, surprised to find that her voice still worked after hours of staying silent to avoid drawing more attention to herself than she already had. "Lily May," he repeated, and somehow her name sounded different when he said it, not like a label attached to property, but like something that mattered. "I'm Joseph Crow Feather, but most folks just call me Joe." Behind them, Jake Morrison was still grumbling about breeds and money and the natural order of things being turned upside down, but Joseph Joe ignored the complaints with the kind of practiced ease that suggested he'd heard it all before. Instead, he pulled out a small knife and cut the ropes binding Lily May's wrists, his movements quick and efficient, but careful not to nick her skin. "Thank you," she said as the circulation returned to her hands in a rush of painful tingling. She rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed them raw, trying to process the strange turn her life had taken in the space of a few minutes. "Don't thank me yet," Joe said, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't read. "You don't know what you're thanking me for." There was something in his tone that made Lily May study his scarred face more carefully, searching for clues about what kind of man had just bought her future with a roll of crisp bills. He was older than she'd first thought, probably in his 30s, with the kind of weathered features that came from spending most of his life outdoors. His clothes were well made but practical, leather vest over a cotton shirt, denim pants that had seen hard use but were clean and mended, boots that were scuffed but well-oiled. Everything about him suggested a man who worked for a living but wasn't poor, who moved in both the white and Cherokee worlds but probably belonged fully to neither. "We should go," he said, glancing toward the saloon's front door, where a group of men had gathered to watch the proceedings with the kind of ugly interest that promised trouble. Crowds like this have a way of getting ideas when they've had too much to drink. Lily May nodded, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt standing in the middle of the saloon with dozens of male eyes tracking her every movement. She'd learned years ago to recognize the signs of impending violence, the way men's voices got quieter and more focused, the subtle shift in posture that meant hands were moving closer to weapons, the particular stillness that preceded the kind of explosion that left people bleeding on barroom floors. Joe must have sensed the same dangerous undercurrents because he placed one hand lightly on the small of Lily May's back, guiding her toward the door with the kind of protective gesture that was somehow both possessive and respectful. She could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of her dress, could sense the controlled strength in his movements as he navigated them through the crowd of disappointed bidders and curious onlookers. "This ain't over, Breed, Jake," Morrison called out as they reached the saloon's swinging doors. "That girl's white, and she don't belong with your kind. Somebody ought to do something about it." Joe paused in the doorway, his shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. For a moment, Lily May thought he might turn around and confront Morrison directly, might let the violence that seemed to simmer just beneath his calm surface finally boil over. But instead, he took a deep breath and continued walking, his hand never leaving her back as he guided her out into the cool night air. "Why didn't you fight him?" Lily May asked once they were outside, away from the saloon's oppressive atmosphere of smoke and sweat and barely contained aggression. Joe was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the street for signs of trouble before he answered. "Because fighting would have made things worse for you," he said finally. "Men like Morrison are looking for excuses to cause trouble. Better to disappoint them." The simple honesty of his answer surprised her. Thomas Carson had always been quick to use his fists when he felt disrespected, had taught her that a man who didn't fight for his pride was no man at all. But there was something in Joe's controlled restraint that suggested a different kind of strength. The kind that came from knowing exactly how dangerous you were, and choosing not to prove it unless absolutely necessary. They walked in silence toward a sturdy-looking wagon hitched to 2 strong horses, the kind of rig that belonged to a man who traveled frequently and needed to carry everything he owned with him. The wagon bed was covered with a canvas tarp that concealed whatever cargo Joe had been hauling, and Lily May found herself wondering what kind of work he did that required both mobility and the kind of cash he'd just spent on her. "Get in," he said, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon's bench seat. "We've got a long ride ahead of us." Lily May hesitated, suddenly aware that she was about to leave the only town she'd known for the past 3 years, riding off into the wilderness with a man she'd met less than an hour ago. Everything rational in her mind screamed that this was dangerous, that she was trading one form of captivity for another that might be even worse. But as she looked back at the saloon, where Jake Morrison and his friends were probably still drinking, and planning God knew what kind of revenge for being outbid by a breed, she realized that whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. She took Joe's offered hand and let him help her up onto the wagon seat, trying not to think too hard about how his calloused fingers seemed to engulf hers completely, or how easily he lifted her, as if she weighed nothing at all. When he swung up beside her and took the reins, she was acutely aware of his presence. The way he smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something clean and outdoorsy. The way his movements had an economy that spoke of years spent doing physical work. The way his dark eyes seemed to take in everything around them without ever appearing to stare. "Where are we going?" she asked, as he clicked to the horses and the wagon began rolling down the dusty main street of Silver Creek. "My place," Joe said, his attention focused on navigating around the other wagons and mounted riders that crowded the town's thoroughfares, even at this late hour. "It's about 2 days' ride north of here, up in the high country, 2 days alone with a man she didn't know, traveling to a place she'd never been, with no clear idea of what would be expected of her when they arrived." The prospect was terrifying, and somehow liberating at the same time. Terrifying because she had no control over her fate. Liberating because for the first time in years, she was leaving behind everything that had made her feel small and worthless and forgotten. As they reached the edge of town, and the wagon wheels found the rutted dirt of the mountain road, Lily May allowed herself one last look back at the life she was leaving behind. Silver Creek spread out below them like a handful of scattered lights. The saloons and gambling halls and houses of ill repute that made up most of the town's business district, glowing against the darkness like fallen stars. Somewhere back there, Thomas Carson was probably drinking away the money he'd gotten for selling her, never giving another thought to the girl he'd raised for 10 years before trading her away like livestock. Somewhere back there, Jake Morrison and his friends were nursing their wounded pride and planning whatever petty revenge they could manage against the Cherokee man who'd outbid them. But all of that was behind her now, receding into the distance with every turn of the wagon wheels. Whatever lay ahead, whether it was better or worse than what she was leaving, it would at least be different. And after 10 years of feeling like she was slowly suffocating under the weight of other people's expectations and disappointments, different was starting to feel like the most precious gift she could imagine. The mountain road stretched out before them like a dark ribbon against the star-filled sky. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lily May Carson felt something that might have been hope beginning to kindle in her chest, like a small, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. The first light of dawn found Lily May Carson huddled in a blanket beside the dying embers of their campfire, watching Joseph Crowfeather move through his morning routine with the fluid precision of a man who had performed these same actions thousands of times before. He checked the horse's hooves and legs with gentle thoroughness, his calloused hands running along their flanks as he murmured to them in what she assumed was Cherokee, the foreign words carrying a musical quality that somehow made the animals calm and attentive in ways she'd never seen before. They had traveled until well past midnight, climbing steadily into the high country along trails that seemed to exist more in Joe's memory than in any visible path through the pine forest. When he'd finally called a halt beside a small creek that bubbled invisibly through the darkness, Lily May had been so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open. But sleep had proven elusive, her mind churning with questions and fears about what morning would bring, about what this silent Cherokee man expected from the girl he'd purchased like a sack of grain or a broken-down horse. Now, watching him work in the pre-dawn stillness, she found herself studying his face for clues about his intentions. In the soft grey light, the harsh angles of his features seemed less intimidating than they had in the saloon's smoky lamplight. The scars she'd noticed the night before were more visible now, a thin white line that ran from his left temple to his jaw, another that disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt, and what looked like an old bullet wound high on his right shoulder that pulled the fabric of his shirt tight when he moved his arm in certain ways. "You're awake," he said without turning around, his voice carrying easily across the small clearing despite its quiet tone. Lily May, startled, realizing she'd been staring at him with the kind of intensity that would have earned her a sharp rebuke from Thomas Carson. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to—" "Nothing to apologize for," Joe interrupted, finally turning to face her. "Coffee's ready if you want some. Trail gets steeper from here, and we'll need the warmth." He poured the dark liquid into a tin cup and handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly in the exchange. His skin was warm, despite the mountain chill, and she noticed that his hands were even more scarred than his face, the kind of permanent damage that came from years of working with tools and weapons and the thousand small dangers that filled. A frontier life. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead and bitter as medicine, but it was hot and real. And Lily May found herself grateful for both the caffeine and the simple human kindness of being offered something without having to ask for it first. She wrapped her hands around the warm metal, using the heat to chase away the last of the night's cold, while she tried to work up the courage to ask the questions that had been plaguing her since they'd left Silver Creek. "What happens when we get to your place?" she finally asked, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her nerve. Joe was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on something in the distance that she couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd been expecting this question, but hadn't quite decided how to answer it. "That depends on what you want to happen," he said carefully. "I'm not looking for a wife, if that's what you're worried about, and I'm not looking for a servant either. What I'm looking for is someone who needs a place to figure out who they are when nobody else is telling them what they should be." The unexpected honesty of his answer caught Lily May off guard. She'd spent the entire night preparing herself for demands and expectations, for being told what her new role would be and how she was expected to fill it. But Joe's words suggested something entirely different, not ownership, but partnership, not control, but freedom. "I don't understand," she said, setting down her coffee cup so she could study his face more carefully. "You paid good money for me. $100 is more than most people see in a year. You must want something in return." Joe's smile was barely visible in the growing light, but it carried a mixture of sadness and understanding that made something tight in Lily May's chest begin to loosen. "What I want," he said, "is to know that there's one less person in this world who has to feel like they don't belong anywhere. What I want is to give you the chance to decide for yourself what your life should look like, instead of having it decided for you by men who see you as property." He stood and began breaking camp with the same efficient movements he'd used for everything else, rolling blankets and securing gear with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent most of his adult life on the trail. But as he worked, he continued talking, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone who was used to thinking out loud during long hours of solitary travel. "I was about your age when I figured out I didn't fit in either world," he said, checking the wagon's harness with careful attention to every buckle and strap. Too Cherokee for the white folks, too white for the Cherokee, spent years trying to be what other people wanted me to be, until I finally realized that the only opinion that mattered was my own. Lily May found herself hanging on every word, hungry for any glimpse into the mind of this man who had disrupted her life so completely. She'd never heard anyone talk about belonging, or the lack of it, with such matter-of-fact acceptance. In her experience, people either belonged or they didn't, and those who didn't were expected to keep quiet about it and be grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance they could find. "How did you know," she asked as they prepared to resume their journey, "that you belonged to yourself, I mean?" Joe helped her up onto the wagon seat with the same careful courtesy he'd shown the night before, his touch respectful but confident. "I stopped trying to earn other people's approval," he said simply. "Started listening to what my own heart was telling me instead of what everyone else thought I should hear. As they pulled back onto the mountain trail, the sun finally cleared. The peaks to the east, flooding the forest with golden light that turned the pine needles into tiny mirrors and made the creek beside them sparkle like scattered diamonds. It was the kind of beauty that made Lily May's chest ache with something she couldn't name, a longing for permanence and peace that she'd never allowed herself to feel before. The trail wound steadily upward through stands of aspen and pine, past meadows where elk grazed in the early morning light and rocky outcroppings that offered glimpses of the vast wilderness stretching away in all directions. Joe pointed out landmarks as they traveled, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a lightning-struck tree that served as a marker for hunters, a hidden spring where the water ran so pure and cold it could cure, almost, any ailment. "You know this country well," Lily May observed, as they stopped to rest the horses beside a small lake that reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror. "Should," Joe said, unhitching the animals so they could drink and graze. "Been living up here for the better part of 15 years. Built my place with my own hands, learned every game trail and water source within 50 miles. "Why here?" she asked. "It's beautiful, but it's so isolated. Don't you get lonely?" Joe's expression grew thoughtful as he considered her question. "Lonely and alone aren't the same thing," he said finally. "I was lonely when I was surrounded by people who didn't understand me. Up here, I'm alone, but I'm not lonely. There's a difference." As they prepared to continue their journey, Joe began teaching Lily May things she'd never learned in her 17 years of life. He showed her how to read the weather in the behavior of birds and the way clouds formed around mountain peaks. He taught her to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, explaining their uses with the kind of detailed knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in country where the nearest doctor might be hundreds of miles away. "This is wild mint," he said, crushing a handful of leaves between his fingers to release their sharp, clean scent. "Good for upset stomachs and headaches. And this," he pointed to a low-growing plant with distinctive three-lobed leaves, "is golden seal. Mix it with hot water, and it'll fight infection better than anything you can buy in town." Lily May found herself fascinated by this practical knowledge, so different from the domestic skills Thomas Carson had grudgingly taught her. Joe's lessons were about survival and self-sufficiency, about understanding the natural world well enough to live as part of it, rather than in opposition to it. For the first time in her life, she was learning things that might actually help her take care of herself, rather than just making her more useful to someone else. When they stopped for their midday meal, Joe surprised her again by asking for her opinion about their route. "There's 2 ways to get to the cabin from here," he said, pointing to a fork in the trail ahead. "The left fork is faster but more exposed. If anyone's following us, they'd be able to spot us from miles away. The right fork takes us through deeper forest, but it adds half a day to the journey." The fact that he was asking her to help make the decision, rather than simply telling her what they were going to do, was so unexpected that Lily May found herself struggling to respond. Thomas Carson had never asked her opinion about anything more significant than what to cook for dinner, and even then he'd usually ignored her suggestions in favor of whatever he was craving at the moment. "Are you expecting someone to follow us?" she asked, trying to match his matter-of-fact tone, even as the possibility sent a chill down her spine. "Morrison and his friends struck me as the type to hold grudges," Joe said calmly. "And there's always the possibility that whoever Carson owed money to might decide you're worth more to them than the $100 I paid for you." The casual way he discussed these potential threats was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring, because it suggested he was prepared to deal with whatever dangers might arise. Terrifying, because it reminded her that her former life was still reaching out to drag her back into situations she'd hoped to escape forever. The forest route, she said decisively. I'd rather take longer to get there than risk running into trouble on the open trail. Joe nodded approvingly. Good choice. Shows you're thinking ahead instead of just reacting to what's in front of you. As they took the right fork and plunged deeper into the wilderness, the conversation turned to more personal topics. Joe began sharing stories about his childhood, growing up caught between two worlds, never quite fitting into either one. His mother had been Cherokee, his father a white trapper who'd loved her deeply, but never fully understood the cultural divide his mixed-blood children would have to navigate. My mother used to say that being caught between two worlds meant you got to see both of them clearly, Joe said, as they navigated a particularly rocky section of trail. The Cherokee saw me as tainted by white blood. The whites saw me as a savage, trying to pretend he was civilized. But that perspective, being an outsider looking in, it taught me things I never would have learned if I'd fit neatly into either category. What kind of things? Lily May asked, genuinely curious about this man who seemed so comfortable with his own contradictions. That most of the things people fight about don't matter as much as they think they do, Joe said. That kindness and respect work the same way in any language, that the color of someone's skin or the circumstances of their birth don't tell you anything important about who they are inside. As the afternoon wore on, Lily May found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Joe's steady presence and calm conversation created a sense of safety she'd almost forgotten was possible. He didn't demand constant attention or entertainment the way Thomas Carson had. He didn't criticize her appearance or her mannerisms or her tendency to ask too many questions. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say, treating her observations and opinions as if they had value. When they made camp that evening beside another mountain stream, Joe began teaching her practical skills that went far beyond the basic survival knowledge he'd shared during their daytime travel. He showed her how to build a fire that would burn efficiently without creating too much smoke, how to set up a shelter that would stay dry even in heavy rain, how to cook over an open flame in ways that would preserve both fuel and food. Why? Are you teaching me all this? Lily May asked as she practiced the knots he'd shown her for securing rope and canvas. Because knowledge is the only thing nobody can take away from you, Joe said, watching her work with the patient attention of a born teacher. Men can steal your money, burn down your house, even sell you like livestock. But what you know, what you can do with your own hands and your own mind, that belongs to you forever. As they settled in for their second night on the trail, Lily May found herself thinking about the profound differences between Joe's approach to teaching and every other educational experience she'd had. Thomas Carson had taught her domestic skills not because he wanted her to be self-sufficient, but because he wanted her to be useful to him. The few formal lessons she'd received had been grudgingly given, and focused on making her just competent enough to avoid embarrassing him in front of his friends. But Joe's teaching seemed motivated by something entirely different, a genuine desire to help her become capable and confident in her own right. He didn't correct her mistakes with impatience or irritation, but with the kind of gentle persistence that suggested he actually cared whether she succeeded or failed. Joe, she said as they sat beside their campfire, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Why did you really buy me? I mean, the real reason. He was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if he'd heard her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory that made her understand this was something he'd never talked about before. I had a sister once, he said, staring into the fire as if the flames held images only he could see. Mixed, blood, like me, but she looked more Cherokee than white. When she was about your age, she got involved with a white man who promised to marry her, take her away from the reservation to live in town like a proper lady. Lily May waited, sensing that this story was both important and painful for him to tell. He lied, Joe continued, used her for a season, then abandoned her when his family found out what he'd been doing. She ended up in a place like that saloon, selling herself to survive because she didn't have anywhere else to go. The bitter pain in his voice made May's chest tighten with sympathy. What happened to her? Died of fever the winter I turned 21, Joe said simply. I was working a cattle drive down in Texas, making good money for the first time in my life. By the time I got back, she'd been in the ground for 3 months. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions, grief, regret, and the kind of helpless anger that came from being too late to save someone you loved. When I saw you standing on that platform, Joe said finally, looking like you'd already given up hope, but still trying to hold on to your dignity, you reminded me of her, of how she might have looked if someone had been there to help her before. She got to that point where there was no way back. Lily May felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had seen her, really seen her, in that moment of ultimate vulnerability. Not as merchandise, or as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth saving simply because she was human and in need of help. I'm not your sister, she said quietly. No, Joe agreed. You're not. You're Lily May Carson, and you're going to figure out who that means you're supposed to be. But you're going to do it in a place where nobody can hurt you while you're learning, and you're going to have all the time and space you need to become whoever you're meant to become. As they banked the fire and prepared for sleep, Lily May found herself looking forward to tomorrow's journey with something that felt dangerously close to excitement. For the first time in her life, she was traveling toward an unknown future that held the possibility of genuine happiness rather than just survival. And for the first time in her life, she was traveling with someone who seemed to believe she was worth the investment of his time, money, and trust. The mountain night was cold and clear, filled with sounds she was learning to identify. The distant call of a night bird, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine branches. But for the first time since she could remember, these wilderness sounds didn't make her feel isolated and afraid. Instead, they made her feel connected to something larger and more permanent than the small, cramped world she'd known before. Tomorrow, they would reach Joe's cabin, and her new life would truly begin. Tonight, she would sleep peacefully under a blanket of stars, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with someone who had already proven he saw her as more than just another person's cast-off property. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the sound of Joe's quiet breathing across the campfire, steady and reassuring as a heartbeat, promising that she was no longer alone in the world. The cabin materialized from the morning, mist like something from a dream, its log walls golden in the early sunlight and smoke curling from the stone chimney in lazy spirals that dissolved into the crystal-clear mountain air. Lily May Carson sat frozen on the wagon seat, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight of what would be her new home. If home was even the right word for a place that looked like it had grown from the forest itself rather than being built by human hands. The structure was larger than she'd expected, with a wide covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides and windows that gleamed like watchful eyes in the morning light. But it was the setting that truly took her breath away. The cabin sat in a natural bowl carved from the mountainside, surrounded by towering pines and aspens that formed a protective barrier against the outside world. A clear stream wound through the meadow in front of the house, its waters so pure she could see trout darting through the shadows like living jewels. "It's beautiful," she whispered, the words inadequate to capture the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from this hidden valley like warmth from a fire. Joseph Crow Feather, Joe, guided the wagon across a sturdy wooden bridge he'd obviously built himself, the sound of the horses' hooves on the planks echoing off the surrounding peaks like a welcoming drumbeat. As they drew closer to the cabin, Lily May began to notice details that revealed the careful thought that had gone into its construction. The logs were perfectly fitted and chinked with a mixture that kept out wind and weather. The roof was steep, enough to shed snow, but covered with hand-split shingles that would last for decades. Gardens bordered the house on 3 sides, their neat rows showing the remains of a summer's harvest that had been gathered with the precision of someone who understood that survival in this country meant wasting nothing. "You built all this yourself?" she asked as Joe brought the wagon to a halt beside a barn that was almost as impressive as the house itself. "Most of it," Joe replied, swinging down from the driver's seat with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "Had some help with the heavy lifting from a few Cherokee friends, but the design and most of the work was mine." He moved around the wagon to help her down, and Lily May found herself studying his face as he approached. There was pride there, but not the boastful kind she'd grown accustomed to seeing in men who wanted to impress others with their accomplishments. This was something quieter and more private, the satisfaction of a man who had created something lasting and beautiful with his own hands, something that would endure long after he was gone. As her feet touched the ground, Lily May became aware of sounds she hadn't noticed from the wagon, the musical babble of the stream, the whisper of wind through pine branches, and something else that made her turn her head in surprise. Somewhere nearby she could hear the soft lowing of cattle and the gentle nickering of horses. "You have livestock?" she asked, following Joe as he began unhitching the team. "Small herd of cattle, a few horses, some chickens," Joe said, his attention focused on the harness buckles, but his voice carrying the warmth of a man discussing old friends. "Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me in meat and milk and eggs through the winter." As if summoned by his words, a magnificent stallion appeared at the fence of a nearby corral, his coat the color of burnished copper and his mane flowing like liquid fire in the morning breeze. The horse whinnied a greeting that Joe answered with a low whistle, and Lily May watched in amazement as the animal trotted over to the fence with the eager enthusiasm of a dog welcoming its master home. "That's Thunder," Joe said, producing an apple from his pocket and offering it to the stallion on his open palm. "Found him as a colt with a broken leg, nursed him back to health. He's been my partner ever since." The relationship between man and horse was immediately apparent. Thunder nuzzled Joe's shoulder with obvious affection, while Joe scratched behind the animal's ears with the kind of gentle attention that spoke of years of mutual trust and respect. Watching them together, Lily May felt a stab of something that might have been envy. She'd never had a relationship like that with any living creature, had never experienced the kind of unconditional loyalty and affection that seemed to flow between Joe and his horse. "Come on," Joe said, shouldering their travel packs and leading the way toward the cabin's front porch. "Let me show you around, then we'll get you settled." The interior of the cabin was even more impressive than its exterior. The main room was spacious and filled with handcrafted furniture that showed the same attention to detail as the building itself. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth flanked by comfortable chairs that invited long evenings of conversation or quiet reading. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that ranged from practical guides to farming and animal husbandry to works of literature and philosophy that spoke of a mind hungry for knowledge and beauty. "You read?" Lily May asked, running, her fingers along the spine of a leather-bound copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. "Every chance I get," Joe replied, setting their packs beside the door. "Books are like friends. They're always there when you need them, and they never judge you for the questions you ask." The kitchen was a marvel of efficient design, with a large wood-burning stove, hand-pumped well water, and storage cabinets that held enough supplies to last through a hard winter. But it was the small touches that caught Lily May's attention. Wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill, hand-carved wooden utensils hanging from pegs beside the stove, and a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning sun that streamed through the east-facing window. "This is where you'll sleep," Joe said, opening a door that led to a small but comfortable bedroom. The room held a narrow bed covered with a quilt that looked like it had been made by skilled hands, a chest of drawers carved from what appeared to be a single piece of pine, and another window that offered a view of the stream and the meadow beyond. Lily May stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of having a space that was entirely her own. The room was clean and bright, with none of the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the places she'd slept during her years with Thomas Carson. Here she could close the door and know that no one would enter without permission. Here she could arrange her few possessions however she liked, could sit by the window and watch the changing light on the mountains without someone telling her she was wasting time that could be better spent on chores. "It's perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Joe replied, and she could hear genuine satisfaction in his tone. "Take some time to get settled. When you're ready, come find me outside. There's a lot to show you, and we'll need to start planning for winter." After he left, Lily May sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the enormity of the change in her circumstances. 3 days ago, she'd been sleeping on a straw mattress in Thomas Carson's cramped cabin, wondering if she'd ever have a life worth living. Now she was sitting in a room that felt like sanctuary, surrounded by beauty and peace she'd never imagined possible. But with the wonder came fear, the persistent worry that this was all too good to be true, that she'd wake up to find herself back in Silver Creek or worse. She'd learned not to trust happiness when it came too easily, had been disappointed too many times by promises that turned out to be lies or traps. A soft knock on the door interrupted her brooding. "Lily May?" Joe's voice carried through the wood, gentle but concerned. "Everything all right?" She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his dark eyes searching her face with the kind of perceptive attention that made her feel like he could see straight through to her doubts and fears. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then caught herself. "Actually, no. I'm scared." "Of what?" Joe asked, and the simple directness of the question made it easier to answer honestly. "Of this being temporary," she admitted. "Of you changing your mind about me being here. Of not being able to be what you need me to be." Joe was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice carried the same patient kindness she'd come to associate with his teaching. "Lily May," he said, "I didn't bring you here because I needed you to be anything other than yourself. I brought you here because I believe you deserve a chance to figure out who that self really is, away from people who've spent years telling you who you should be." He gestured toward the main room, and she followed him to the chairs beside the fireplace. Even though the morning was warm, he lit a small fire, and the cheerful crackle of burning wood seemed to chase away some of the shadows that had been gathering in her mind. "When I first came to this valley," Joe said, settling into the chair, across from her, "I was running from something too, not people trying to hurt me, but the weight of never being able to please anyone no matter how hard I tried. The Cherokee thought I was too white, the whites thought I was too Indian. I spent years trying to be what other people wanted, and I was miserable." "What changed?" Lily May asked, drawn into his story despite her fears. "I stopped trying to fit in," Joe said simply. "Started listening to what made sense to me instead of what other people said should make sense. Built this place not because it was what anyone expected, but because it felt right. Started living by my own rules instead of trying to follow everyone else's." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped loosely together. "That's what I'm offering you, Lily May. Not a new set of rules to follow, but the time and space to figure out what your own rules should be." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. the sound of horses approaching at speed, accompanied by voices that carried the harsh edge of men who were angry and looking for trouble. Joe's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his relaxed posture shifting to alert readiness as he moved to the window and peered through the curtains. "Who is it?" Lily May asked, her heart hammering with sudden fear. "Morrison and two of his friends," Joe said grimly. "They must have followed our trail." The sound of boots on the porch steps was followed by pounding on the front door, the kind of aggressive knocking that was meant to intimidate rather than simply announce a visitor's presence. "Open up, Breed," Jake Morrison's voice carried through, the wood slurred by drink but sharp with malice. "We know you got the girl in there, and we've come to take her back where she belongs." Joe moved away from the window, his movements controlled but purposeful, as he walked to a cabinet and withdrew a rifle that had been cleaned and oiled with obvious care. The sight of the weapon should have frightened Lily May, but instead, she found it oddly comforting, evidence that Joe was prepared to protect what was his, including her. "Stay here," he told her quietly. "Whatever happens, don't come outside unless I call for you." "Joe!" She started, but he was already moving toward the door. "We just want to talk," Morrison called out, his tone taking on a false reasonableness. That fooled no one. "No need for trouble between neighbors." Joe opened the door, but remained in the threshold, the rifle held casually but ready, his presence filling the doorway in a way that made it clear he wasn't about to be intimidated by drunk cowboys with more pride than sense. "You're not my neighbors," Joe said calmly. "You're trespassing on my land." From her position by the window, Lily May could see the three men who had ridden into Joe's peaceful valley. Morrison looked even more dangerous than he had in the saloon, his face flushed with alcohol and his eyes bright with the kind of mean excitement that came from hunting something weaker than himself. His companions were cut from the same cloth, hard, men who'd never learned to solve problems with anything other than violence. "That girl don't belong to you," Morrison said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "She's white, and it ain't natural for her to be living with a half-breed savage like some kind of squaw." "What's natural," Joe replied, his voice deadly, quiet, "is for people to live where they choose to live, with whoever they choose to live with. Lily May is here because she wants to be here." "You telling me she chose this?" Morrison laughed, the sound ugly and disbelieving. "Living in the middle of nowhere with a breed who probably don't even speak proper English half the time." Lily May felt anger flare in her chest at the casual cruelty of Morrison's words, at the way he dismissed Joe's humanity as casually as he might swat a fly. Without thinking, she moved away from the window and toward the door, her fear overwhelmed by the need to defend the man who had shown her more kindness in 3 days than she'd received in the previous 10 years. "I chose this," she said, stepping into the doorway beside Joe, despite his sharp look of concern. "I chose him, and I chose this place, and I chose to get as far away as possible from men like you who think they have the right to decide what's best for everyone else." The words came out stronger and more confident than she'd expected, carrying all the frustration and anger she'd been holding back for years. Morrison's face darkened at her defiance, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Girl's been brainwashed," one of his companions muttered. "Probably don't even know what she's saying anymore." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Lily May shot back. "I'm saying that I'd rather live in the wilderness with a good man than in town with people who think they can buy and sell human beings like livestock." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, the kind of electric anticipation that preceded violence. Joe seemed to sense it too because he shifted his position slightly, the rifle now more obviously ready for use. "You've had your say," Joe told Morrison. "Now you need to leave my land." "Or what?" Morrison challenged, his bravado fueled by the presence of his friends and the whiskey he'd obviously consumed on the ride up the mountain. "Or I'll remove you," Joe said simply. "And trust me, you don't want that." For a moment, the confrontation. Balanced on a knife's edge, three drunk cowboys weighing their chances against a man who was sober, alert, and fighting to protect his home. Lily May held her breath, waiting to see which way the moment would tip. Then Morrison's horse shied at something, a sound from the forest, or perhaps just the tension radiating from the humans around it, and the spell was broken. Morrison fought to control his mount, cursing and jerking at the reins in a way that spoke of poor horsemanship and worse temper. "This ain't over," he snarled as he regained control of his horse. "People are going to hear about this." "About what?" "You're doing up here, and they ain't going to like it. Let them hear," Joe replied calmly. "I've got nothing to hide." The three men wheeled their horses and rode back toward the trail, their departure marked by more cursing and threats that gradually faded into the distance. Joe stood watching until they disappeared into the forest, his rifle still ready, his attention focused on potential ambush points along the route they'd taken. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had completely faded did he finally relax, lowering the rifle and turning to face Lily May with an expression that mixed pride with concern. "That was brave," he said, "but it was also dangerous. Men like Morrison don't take well to being challenged, especially by women." "I couldn't just stand there and let him talk about you like that," Lily May said, surprised by her own vehemence. "After everything you've done for me, the least I could do was speak up when someone was treating you like you were less than human." Joe's smile was small, but genuine, carrying a warmth that made something tight in Lily May's chest begin to loosen. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's been a long time since anyone stood up for me." As they walked back into the cabin, Lily May realized that something fundamental had changed during the confrontation with Morrison. She was no longer just a frightened girl grateful for rescue. She was someone who had chosen to take a stand, to defend not just herself, but someone who mattered to her. For the first time in her life, she had acted not from fear or obligation, but from a sense of loyalty and righteous anger that came from deep inside her own heart. The feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing you had wings. She was discovering that she was capable of courage she'd never known she possessed, capable of caring about someone else's welfare more than her own safety. But as Joe barred the door and checked the windows, she also understood that Morrison's visit had changed everything. Their peaceful sanctuary was no longer secret, no longer safe from the outside world's intrusion. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, but they would face it knowing that there were people out there who would never accept their unconventional family, people who would go to great lengths to destroy what they'd built in this hidden valley. The war for her right to belong somewhere had only just begun. The first blizzard of winter struck 3 weeks after Morrison's visit, descending from the high peaks like the wrath of an angry god. Lily May Carson had never experienced cold like this, the kind that turned breath to ice crystals in the air and made exposed skin numb within seconds. She pressed her face to the cabin's frost-covered window, watching the snow pile against the barn in drifts that already reached past the lower rails of the corral fence, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked Joseph Crowfeather Joe, as he added another log to the fire that had become their lifeline against the brutal mountain winter. "This one?" Joe paused in his work, listening to the howl of wind that made the cabin's sturdy walls groan and creak like a ship in a storm. "Could be 3 days, could be a week. Hard to tell until it decides to move on." The casual way he discussed being trapped by weather that could kill them both should have been reassuring, but instead it highlighted just how dependent she'd become on his knowledge and experience. In the weeks since Morrison's confrontation, Joe had been preparing them both for winter with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that survival in the high country meant planning for disasters that could strike without warning. He'd taught her to preserve meat by smoking and salting, to store root vegetables in the root cellar he'd dug beneath the cabin's floor, to recognize the signs that warned of incoming storms. She'd learned to milk the cow and gather eggs from the chickens, to split firewood and maintain the kind of fires that would burn efficiently through long, cold nights. But despite all the practical knowledge she'd absorbed, she still felt like a child playing at being an adult, dependent on Joe's expertise for everything that really mattered. "Don't look so worried," Joe said, settling into the chair across from her with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. "We've got enough food and fuel to last until spring if we're careful. The animals are safe in the barn, and this cabin has weathered worse storms than this one." Outside, thunder whinnied from the barn, the sound barely audible over the wind, but somehow conveying the stallion's restless energy. The other animals, the milk cow, the chickens, and the small herd of cattle that Joe had driven into the sheltered a valley behind the cabin, were all secure, but Lily May could hear the worry in their occasional lowing and bleating. Even the animals understood that this storm was something special, something that demanded respect and preparation. "Tell me about your worst winter," Lily May said, partly to distract herself from the storm's fury, and partly because she'd come to treasure the stories Joe told about his years in the mountains. His voice had a quality that made even dangerous experiences sound like adventures, and she found herself hungry for any glimpse into the life he'd built before she became part of it. Joe's smile was rueful as he stared into the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. 1874, he said without hesitation. Storm lasted 9 days, temperature dropped so low that the sap in the pine trees froze and made them sound like gunshots when they cracked. Lost half my cattle that year and came close to losing myself. What happened? Lily May pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, settling in for what she hoped would be a long story that would help her forget about the wind trying to tear the roof off their sanctuary. "I was younger then," Joe said, his voice taking on the rhythm of a practiced storyteller. "Thought I knew everything there was to know about mountain winters. Had a smaller cabin then, not as well built as this one, and I'd gotten cocky about my preparations." He paused to sip his coffee, and Lily May found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into his narrative despite the storm raging outside. "Third day of the blizzard, I realized I was running low on firewood. The pile I'd thought would last 2 weeks was going to be gone in another day or two if I kept the fire burning hot enough to keep from freezing to death." "What did you do?" Lily May asked, even though she suspected the answer would involve the kind of dangerous decision that separated survivors from casualties in country this unforgiving. "Went out into the storm," Joe said simply. "Had to. Choice was freeze to death in the cabin or risk freezing to death trying to get more wood. At least the second option gave me a chance." He described the experience with the matter-of-fact tone he used for all his stories, but Lily May could hear the echoes of genuine terror beneath his calm narration. Fighting through snow that was waist-deep and wind that threatened to knock him down with every step, following the rope he'd strung between the cabin and the woodpile to keep from getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Finding the woodpile buried under drifts that had to be dug away by hand, his fingers going numb despite the thick gloves he wore. "Made 6 trips, Joe said. Each one a little more dangerous than the last because the storm kept getting worse. On the last trip, I lost the rope." The simple statement carried a weight that made Lily May's stomach clench with sympathetic fear. She'd learned enough about wilderness survival to understand that losing your guideline in a blizzard was often a death sentence. People had frozen to death 20 feet from their own front doors because they couldn't find their way through the blinding snow. "How did you make it back?" she asked. "Pure luck," Joe said, "and maybe a little help from ancestors who weren't ready to see me join them yet. I stumbled around in the snow for what felt like hours, getting colder and more disoriented with every step. Finally walked straight into the side of the cabin, nearly knocked myself unconscious, but at least I knew where I was." He'd made it inside with minutes to spare before hypothermia would have claimed him. his clothes frozen to his body, and his hands so numb he couldn't work the buttons or laces. Spent the next 3 days huddled by the fire, burning the wood he'd risked his life to gather while the storm raged outside with undiminished fury. "That's when I decided to build this place," Joe said, gesturing at the solid walls around them. "Bigger, better insulated, with enough storage space to keep everything I'd need for the worst storm I could imagine. And then I planned for one twice as bad as that." The story should have been comforting, proof that Joe had survived worse conditions than this and emerged stronger for the experience. But instead, it highlighted the precarious nature of their existence, the way survival in this beautiful but deadly country depended on constant vigilance and preparation for disasters that could strike without warning. "Do you ever regret it?" Lily May asked. "Choosing to live so far from other people, so far from help if something goes wrong?" Joe was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the frost-covered windows. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested this was a question he'd asked himself many times. "Every winter I ask myself that same question," he said. "Every time I have to choose between taking a risk or playing it safe. Every time I realize how alone I really am up here. And every spring when the snow melts and the valley turns green again, I remember why I chose this life." He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious and intent. "Freedom isn't free, Lily May. It costs you the comfort of knowing other people will take care of you when things go wrong. But it gives you something else, the knowledge that whatever you build, whatever you accomplish, you did it with your own hands and your own decisions." The philosophical discussion was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze, the unmistakable crack of wood giving way under pressure. Joe was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle and moving toward the window with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "What is it?" Lily May whispered, fear making her voice barely audible. "Tree coming down," Joe said grimly, peering through the frost at something she couldn't see. "Big one by the sound of it." The crash, when it came, shook the entire cabin and rattled every piece of glass in the windows. Joe cursed under his breath, the first time Lily May had heard him use profanity, and she knew immediately that whatever had fallen, it was going to complicate their survival in ways she couldn't even imagine. "The barn," Joe said, his voice tight with concern. "Tree came down across the roof. I need to check on the animals." The idea of Joe going outside in the storm's fury terrified Lily May more than anything had since Morrison's visit. The wind was strong enough to knock a man down, the cold bitter enough to kill in minutes, and the snow so thick that visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. "You can't go out there," she said, grabbing his arm as he reached for his heavy winter coat. "It's suicide. The animals will have to wait until the storm passes." Joe looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, and she saw something in his expression that made her realize she'd misunderstood the situation completely. If that tree damaged the barn badly enough, the animals could freeze to death. "Before morning," he said gently. "Thunder's been my partner for 8 years. I'm not going to let him die because I was too scared to brave a little wind and snow." The casual way he dismissed conditions that could kill him as a little wind and snow would have been infuriating if it hadn't been so clearly motivated by genuine love for the animals that depended on him. Lily May understood then that this was one of those moments Joe had talked about when survival meant choosing between risks, when playing it safe might be the most dangerous choice of all. "Then I'm coming with you," she said, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. Joe's immediate response was a sharp shake of his head. "Absolutely not. You don't have the experience for conditions like this. If something happens to you, I'll die anyway." Lily May interrupted, her practical nature overriding her fear. "I don't know enough about this place to survive on my own until spring. At least if we're together, we can help each other." For a moment, Joe looked like he was going to argue further. Then his expression shifted, and she saw him considering her words with the same careful attention he gave to all important decisions. "You do exactly what I tell you," he said finally. "No arguments, no delays, no trying to be helpful, unless I ask for help. One mistake out there and we could both die." Bundling up for the journey to the barn, a distance of perhaps 50 yards that might as well have been 50 miles in these conditions, took nearly 10 minutes. Layer upon layer of clothing, scarves wrapped around their faces to protect against frostbite, ropes tied around their waists and connected to each other so they wouldn't become separated in the blinding snow. The moment they opened the cabin door, the storm tried to push them back inside with a violence that was almost personal. The wind hit Lily May like a physical blow, driving snow into every gap in her clothing, despite all their careful preparations. The cold was so intense it made her lungs ache with every breath, and within seconds she could no longer feel her fingers or toes despite the thick gloves and boots she wore. Joe's voice was barely audible over the wind's howl, but she could make out his shouted instructions. "Stay close, follow the rope, don't let go no matter what." The journey to the barn took forever and no time at all. A nightmare of stumbling through snow that reached past their knees while the wind tried to knock them down with every step. Lily May lost track of direction within seconds, trusting completely in Joe's navigation and the rope that connected them like a lifeline. More than once she stumbled and would have fallen if not for Joe's steady presence ahead of her, his strength keeping her upright when her own legs threatened to give out. When they finally reached the barn, Lily May was so cold and exhausted she could barely stand. But the sight that greeted them when Joe managed to force open the heavy door made her forget her own discomfort entirely. The massive pine tree had indeed crashed through the barn's roof, its trunk spanning the entire width of the structure and its branches creating a maze of obstacles that blocked access to the animal stalls. But the damage, while dramatic, was not as catastrophic as they'd feared. The tree had fallen at an angle that left most of the stalls intact, and the animals, while frightened and restless, appeared to be uninjured. Thunder whinnied a greeting when he saw Joe, the sound carrying relief and joy that transcended species. Barriers. The stallion had been trapped in his stall by fallen branches, but Joe was able to clear the debris with the axe he kept in the barn for just such emergencies. Within minutes, Thunder was free, nuzzling Joe's shoulder with the kind of affection that spoke of a bond deeper than simple ownership. "The others?" Lily May asked, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face. "Scared but safe," Joe replied, checking each animal with the careful attention of someone who understood that their survival depended on keeping their livestock healthy. "We'll need to do some repairs once the storm passes, but they'll make it through the night." The return journey to the cabin was, if anything, even more harrowing than the trip to the barn. The storm had intensified while they worked, and the cold was beginning to penetrate even their heavy winter clothing. By the time they stumbled through the cabin door, both of them were showing the early signs of hypothermia, sluggish movements, slurred speech, and the kind of bone-deep cold that made thinking clearly almost impossible. Joe immediately set about building up the fire, while Lily May struggled out of her frozen outer garments, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't work. The buttons and ties. When Joe noticed her difficulty, he moved to help her, his own hands steady despite everything they'd been through. "We need to get warm," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd dealt with cold-related injuries before. "Hypothermia can kill you even after you think you're safe." What followed was the most intimate experience of Lily May's life, though it had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. Joe helped her remove her wet clothes, his touch completely clinical and focused on getting her warm and dry as quickly as possible. He wrapped her in every blanket he could find, then sat beside her in front of the fire, sharing his body heat while they both waited for their core temperatures to return to normal. For the first time since she'd known him, Joe was trembling. Not from fear, but from the simple physical reaction to extreme cold. Seeing this man who seemed invincible in every other circumstance, reduced to the same vulnerable state she was in, made Lily May understand something fundamental about their relationship. They were partners now, not just in the legal sense of sharing a household, but in the deeper sense of two people whose survival depended on each other. Joe had risked his life to save his animals, and she had risked hers to help him. Neither of them could have accomplished what they'd done alone, and both of them understood that this was just the first of many challenges they would face together. "Thank you," Joe said quietly, as feeling began to return to their extremities. "For coming with me, for not letting me face that alone." "Thank you for letting me," Lily May replied. "For trusting me to help instead of trying to protect me from everything dangerous." As they sat by the fire, gradually warming back to life, Lily May realized that something fundamental had changed between them during their battle with the storm. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd rescued from the auction block, and he was no longer just the mysterious man who'd bought her freedom. They were family now, bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence in ways that went deeper than blood or law. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside their small sanctuary, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances sat by the fire and understood that they had become something neither of them had been alone. They had become strong enough to survive whatever the world might throw at them, as long as they faced it together. When morning finally came, it would bring new challenges and new tests of their resolve. But tonight, they were safe and warm and alive, and that was enough. Spring arrived in the hidden valley like a miracle, transforming the world from stark white to brilliant green in what seemed like days rather than weeks. Lily May Carson stood in the doorway of the cabin she now thought of as home, breathing in air that carried the scent of wildflowers and new grass, watching Joseph Crowfeather Joe work with thunder to break the winter's ice dam that had formed where the stream curved around a cluster of boulders. The sight of man and horse working in perfect harmony, their movements synchronized by years of partnership and trust, filled her with a contentment so profound it was almost painful. The harsh months had changed them both. Joe moved with a slight limp now, courtesy of a fall he'd taken while repairing the barn roof damaged by the winter storm. The injury wasn't serious, but it served as a constant reminder of how precarious their existence really was, how dependent they were on each other's strength and skill. Lily May herself had grown leaner and stronger, her hands permanently stained now by the work of tanning hides and preserving meat, her arms corded with muscle from splitting firewood and hauling water. But the changes went deeper than physical transformation. She carried herself differently now, with the confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. "Lily May!" Joe's voice carried across the meadow, interrupting her morning reverie. "Come see this." She walked toward the stream, her bare feet enjoying the sensation of soft grass after months of frozen ground. Joe was crouched beside the water, pointing to something that made his dark eyes bright with excitement. "Trout," he said simply, indicating the shadows that darted through the clear water. "Biggest run I've seen in 5 years. We'll eat well this summer." The simple pleasure he took in the return of the fish, the way his face lit up with genuine joy at this sign of nature's renewal, reminded Lily May of how much she'd come to love this man, not romantically, but with the deep affection of someone who had found family in the most unexpected place. Joe had become the father she'd never had, the teacher she'd always needed, the anchor that kept her steady when the world tried to convince her she didn't belong anywhere. Their peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Not the casual clip-clop of travelers, but the urgent thunder of riders pushing their mounts hard. Joe was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle that was never far from his side these days. The weapon had become as much a part of his daily equipment as his hat or his boots, a grim reminder that their sanctuary was not as isolated as they'd hoped. "How many?" Lily May asked, moving automatically to Joe's side. The winter had taught them to function as a unit, to anticipate each other's needs and reactions without conscious thought. "At least 6, Joe said grimly, his experienced ear parsing the sound of hoofbeats with the skill of someone who'd learned that such details could mean the difference between life and death. "Maybe more." The riders emerged from the tree line. Like a small army, their dust cloud visible long before their faces became clear. Jake Morrison rode in the lead, but he was no longer the simple cowboy who'd confronted them the previous autumn. Now he wore a deputy's badge on his chest and carried himself with the authority of someone who believed the law was on his side. Behind him rode 5 other men, all armed, all wearing expressions that promised trouble. But it was the 7th rider who made Lily May's blood run cold. Thomas Carson, the man who had called himself her father for 10 years before selling her, like livestock to pay his gambling debts. He looked older and meaner than she remembered, his face bearing the marks of a hard winter and harder choices. When his eyes found her across the meadow, she saw something in them that made her understand this confrontation would be unlike anything they'd faced before. Joseph Crow Feather. Morrison's voice carried across the valley with the authority of legal power. "By order of the territorial court, you're under arrest for kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment." Joe's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Kidnapping? I paid good money for her in front of witnesses, everything legal and proper." "That auction was illegal," Morrison shot back, his voice taking on the righteousness of someone who'd found a technicality to hang his hat on. "Carson here was drunk when he signed the papers, didn't have the legal authority to dispose of his ward's custody, makes the whole transaction void." Thomas Carson urged his horse forward, his weak chin thrust out in an attempt at defiance that fooled no one. "I made a mistake," he called out, his voice carrying across the meadow with practiced self-pity. "Been trying to get my girl back ever since. The law says she belongs with her legal guardian, not with some half-breed savage living in sin in the wilderness." The words hit Lily May like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of how easily the world could rewrite history to suit its prejudices. The man who had sold her to strangers was now claiming to be her rescuer. The legal system that had allowed her to be auctioned like cattle was now declaring that auction invalid. And the sanctuary she'd found with Joe was being redefined as imprisonment and degradation. "I won't go with him," Lily May said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "Thomas Carson sold me to pay his gambling debts. He has no claim on me now." "That's where you're wrong, girl," Morrison replied with the smug satisfaction of someone who'd done his legal homework. "Until you turn 18 or get married legal-like, you belong to your guardian, and Carson here is willing to forgive your indiscretions if you come back where you belong." The trap was elegant and complete. The law that should have protected her was being used as a weapon against her, and the man who'd betrayed her was being cast as her salvation. Worse, she could see in Morrison's eyes that this was just the beginning. If they took her back to town, there would be other charges, other legal maneuvers designed to destroy Joe and everything they'd built together. And if she refuses, Joe asked quietly, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that Lily May had learned to associate with barely controlled violence. "Then we take her anyway," Morrison said, his hand resting casually on his pistol, "and you get charged with resisting lawful authority on top of everything else." For a moment, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, 7 armed men against 1, with Lily May caught in the middle like a prize to be won or lost. Joe's rifle was ready, but even his skill with weapons couldn't overcome those odds. And if he tried to fight, Lily May knew the result would be his death and her return to a life that would be worse than anything she'd endured before. That's when Thunder changed everything. The stallion had been grazing peacefully near the stream when the riders arrived, but as the tension escalated, the horse began moving closer to Joe with the alert attention of a trained warhorse sensing battle. Now, as Morrison's men began to spread out in what was obviously a practiced maneuver to surround Joe and cut off any avenue of escape, Thunder suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his magnificent copper coat gleaming in the morning sun, his challenging scream echoing off the valley walls like a battle cry. The sound spooked several of the posse's horses, causing them to shy and dance as their riders fought to maintain control. In the confusion that followed, Joe made a decision that changed everything. "Lily May," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Morrison, "get on, Thunder." "Joe, no," she whispered, understanding immediately what he was planning. "I won't leave." You're not leaving me," Joe said, his voice carrying the gentle authority she'd learned to trust completely. "You're giving us both a chance to survive this." Thunder had moved within arm's reach now, his reins trailing on the ground, but his attention focused completely on Joe. The stallion stood perfectly still as Lily May approached, as if he understood the gravity of the situation and his role in whatever was about to happen. "Listen to me," Joe said urgently as she grabbed Thunder's mane and swung herself onto the horse's bare back. "There's a Cherokee settlement 3 days' ride north of here. Follow the stream until it splits. Then take the eastern fork. Ask for Chief Standing Bear and tell him you're under Joe Crowfeather's protection. He'll keep you safe until this gets sorted out." "What about you?" Lily May asked, though she already knew the answer from the resignation in Joe's voice. "I'll buy you as much time as I can," Joe said simply. "Then I'll follow when it's safe." Morrison had regained control of his spooked horse and was shouting orders to his men, but the momentary chaos had given Joe and Lily May the precious seconds they needed. Joe slapped Thunder's rump with his open palm and shouted a command in Cherokee that sent the stallion leaping forward like a released arrow. The last thing Lily May heard as Thunder carried her toward the tree line was the sound of Joe's rifle speaking its deadly authority, followed by shouts of pain and anger that told her at least one of Morrison's men had learned the hard way, that cornering a desperate man was a dangerous game. Thunder ran like the wind itself, his powerful legs eating up the miles with a speed that left the pursuing posse far behind. Lily May had never ridden bareback before, had never experienced the pure exhilaration of moving in perfect harmony with such a magnificent animal. But grief and fear overrode any pleasure she might have taken in the experience. Every stride that carried her away from the hidden valley also carried her away from Joe, and she had no way of knowing if she would ever see him again. The Cherokee settlement, when she finally reached it after 2 days of hard travel, was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. The village sat in a natural bowl surrounded by forested hills, its log cabins and traditional structures blending so seamlessly with the landscape that she almost rode past without seeing them. It was only Thunder's sudden alertness, his ears pricked forward and his pace slowing to a more respectful walk, that told her they'd arrived at their destination. The people who emerged to greet them were equally unlike her expectations. She'd heard Cherokee described as savages so often that she'd unconsciously expected to find people who matched that description. Instead, she found a community that seemed to blend the best of both worlds, traditional Cherokee customs and clothing mixed with practical adaptations to frontier life, people who spoke both English and Cherokee with equal fluency, children playing games that combined elements of both cultures. Chief Standing Bear was a man in his 60s, his long grey hair braided with feathers and beads, but his clothing practical frontier wear that could have belonged to any successful rancher or merchant. When Lily May delivered Joe's message, his weathered face broke into a smile that transformed. His stern features completely. "Joe Crow Feather," he said in English, accented by Cherokee rhythms. "That boy always did have a talent for finding trouble. What's he gotten himself into this time?" Lily May told the story as simply as she could, starting with the auction in Silver Creek and ending with their escape from Morrison's posse. Chief Standing Bear listened without interruption, his dark eyes growing more serious as she described the legal trap that had been constructed around them. "The white man's law," he said when she finished, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd dealt with such contradictions many times before. "It bends whichever way serves their purposes. What matters to them isn't justice, but maintaining. The order they've decided is proper. Can you help us?" Lily May asked, though she wasn't entirely sure what kind of help would be possible against the power of territorial law. Chief Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the village boundaries. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected many lives. "There are two kinds of law," he said. "The law written in books by men who've never lived the lives they're trying to regulate, and the law written in the heart by experience and conscience. Joe Crowfeather follows the second law, and so do we." What followed was 3 days of preparation, unlike anything Lily May had ever witnessed. The Cherokee moved with the quiet efficiency of people preparing for war, but it was a different kind of warfare than she'd expected. Instead of weapons and battle plans, they prepared legal documents and witness statements. Instead of war paint and feathers, they donned their finest clothes and practiced their most formal English. "We fight them with their own weapons," Chief Standing Bear explained, as a dozen Cherokee men and women prepared to accompany Lily May back to Silver Creek. Law and witnesses and the kind of respectability they can't dismiss as savage behavior. The return journey took 4 days, not because of the distance, but because they traveled as a formal delegation rather than fleeing refugees. Lily May rode Thunder at the head of the procession, flanked by Cherokee warriors who carried themselves with the dignity of ambassadors rather than the aggression of raiders. Behind them came a wagon loaded with legal documents, witness statements, and the kind of evidence that could stand up in any territorial court. When they crested the final hill overlooking Silver Creek, Lily May felt her heart stop. The town looked the same as always. Dusty streets, ramshackle buildings, the eternal crowd of drifters and fortune seekers that gave frontier towns their particular atmosphere. But she could see the jail from this distance, and the thought that Joe might be locked inside those stone walls made her chest tight with fear and anger. "Easy," Chief Standing Bear said quietly, reading her expression with the perception of someone who'd seen that look on many faces over the years. "We're not here for revenge. We're here for justice. There's a difference, and it matters." As their procession rode down the main street of Silver Creek, Lily May became aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. A Cherokee delegation was rare enough in these parts, but a Cherokee delegation accompanying a white girl on horseback was unprecedented. She could feel the weight of every eye, could practically hear the gossip and speculation that would fill every saloon and parlor for weeks to come. The courthouse, when they reached it, was already packed with spectators who'd somehow heard about their arrival. Morrison stood near the front of the crowd, his deputy's badge catching the afternoon light, his face showing the kind of angry frustration that came from having simple plans complicated by unexpected developments. Beside him, Thomas Carson looked smaller and meaner than ever, his weak features twisted by the knowledge that his carefully constructed story was about to face its first real challenge. But it was the figure who emerged from the courthouse steps that made Lily May's heart leap with relief and joy. Joe walked slowly, favoring his left leg slightly, and she could see the marks of rough treatment in his torn clothes and the bruise that darkened one side of his face. But he was alive, and when his eyes found hers across the crowded street, she saw in them the same steady strength that had carried them through every previous crisis. "Joseph Crow Feather," Chief Standing Bear called out formally, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing large gatherings. "We come to stand witness for truth and justice." The crowd fell silent at his words, understanding instinctively that something unprecedented was about to happen. In the territory where Cherokee were usually seen as obstacles to progress rather than participants in civilized society, the sight of a formal delegation demanding legal recognition was both shocking and compelling. Judge William Harper emerged from the courthouse, his black robes and stern expression marking him as a man who took his responsibilities seriously. He looked back and forth between the Cherokee delegation and the crowd of white spectators, clearly struggling with a situation that had no precedent in his legal experience. "This is highly irregular," he said finally. "Cherokee have no standing in territorial court." "With respect, Your Honor," Chief Standing Bear replied in English so formal and precise it would have impressed any Eastern lawyer. "We are not here as Cherokee. We're here as witnesses to events that occurred within territorial jurisdiction. Unless territorial law has changed to exclude testimony based on the race of the witness." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable, and Judge Harper clearly understood that his next words would set a precedent that would be remembered long after this particular case was resolved. In the end, his commitment to legal procedure overcame his personal prejudices. "This court will hear all relevant testimony," he said formally. "Let the record show that justice is blind to all considerations except truth." As the Cherokee delegation arranged themselves on the courthouse steps and Chief Standing Bear began to speak, Lily May understood that this moment was about much more than her individual fate or Joe's freedom. This was about the kind of world they were all going to live in, the kind of justice that would prevail in a territory caught between two very different ways of understanding law and morality. The reckoning had come at last, and whatever happened next would determine not just their future, but the future of everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Judge William Harper's gavel fell like thunder in the packed courthouse, and the silence that followed was so complete that Lily Mae Carson could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The verdict had taken 3 hours to deliver, with testimony from a dozen Cherokee witnesses, legal arguments that stretched back to treaties signed before she was born, and a parade of character witnesses that included the town doctor, the local preacher, and even the banker who'd been quietly doing business with Joe for years. "In the matter of guardianship," Judge Harper announced, his voice carrying the weight of precedent and conscience, "this court finds that Thomas Carson forfeited his legal rights when he entered into a commercial transaction selling his wards in person. The auction, while irregular, was conducted in good faith by all parties except the seller." Thomas Carson's face went white as the judge's words sank in. Jake Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but Chief Standing Bear's steady gaze and the presence of 12 Cherokee warriors in the courthouse convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court recognizes that Miss Lily Mae Carson has reached an age where her own preferences must be considered. She has testified under oath that she chooses to remain with Joseph Crow Feather, and this court sees no legal impediment to that choice." The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry protests, but Judge Harper's gavel restored order with the authority of law behind it. "However," he added, and the word fell into the courtroom like a stone into still water, "there remains the question of propriety. An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man, regardless of the circumstances, creates a situation that this court cannot officially sanction." Lily Mae felt her heart sink as she realized the trap that had been set for them. Even in victory, the law would find a way to separate them, to force them into choices that served society's comfort rather than their own happiness. That's when Joe stepped forward, his injured leg barely slowing him down, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had first drawn Lily May to trust him that night in the saloon. "Your Honor," he said formally, "I'd like to petition this court for permission to legally adopt Lily May Carson as my daughter." The words hit the courtroom like lightning, transforming the entire nature of the proceedings in a single sentence. Adoption would solve the legal problem while preserving the relationship they'd built, would give Lily May the family she'd always craved while protecting Joe from charges of impropriety. Judge Harper leaned forward, his eyes showing interest in this unexpected development. "You wish to adopt an adult woman?" "She's not 18 yet," Joe replied calmly, "and she's never had a father who put her welfare above his own convenience. I'm asking for the chance to be that father, legally and officially." Chief Standing Bear rose from his seat, his weathered face showing approval of Joe's solution. "Your Honor, in Cherokee law, family is not defined by blood, but by commitment and love. Joseph Crow Feather has already proven himself to be more father to this girl than the man who sold her." The legal arguments that followed were complex and precedent-setting, but the emotional truth was simple and undeniable. Joe had rescued Lily May not for his own benefit, but for hers, had taught her and protected her and given her the chance to become the person she was meant to be. Their relationship was built on respect and mutual affection rather than ownership or obligation. When Judge Harper finally granted the adoption petition, the courthouse erupted in celebration. Lily May found herself surrounded by Cherokee women who welcomed her with the warmth of sisters, by townspeople who had watched the proceedings with growing respect for the quiet man who'd been living among them for years. But the moment that mattered most came when Joe approached her, his dark eyes bright with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show publicly. "Hello, daughter," he said simply, and the word carried all the love and acceptance she'd spent 17 years hoping to hear. "Hello, Father," she replied, and felt the last broken piece of her heart click into place like a key finding its lock. 5 years later, Lily May Crow Feather stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching her husband Daniel teach their 3-year-old son to ride the gentle mare that had been Thunder's last gift before old age claimed the magnificent stallion. The hidden valley now held 3 cabins and a thriving horse-breeding operation that drew buyers from across the territory. Joe emerged from the barn, his hair now completely grey, but his movements still sure and strong. He'd found his own happiness. With Sarah Standing Bear, the chief's daughter, their marriage a bridge between 2 worlds that had enriched both. "Regrets?" he asked, joining Lily May on the porch, as they watched their extended family work and play in the meadow where she'd first learned what belonging truly meant. "Only one," Lily May said, taking his scarred hand in hers. "That it took me 17 years to find my way home." Joe squeezed her fingers gently. "Sometimes the best things are worth waiting for." As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Lily May understood that family wasn't something you were born into, but something you chose to build with people who saw your worth when the world saw only your flaws. She'd found her place not by becoming someone else's idea of who she should be, but by becoming exactly who she was meant to be all along. The girl who'd never felt a father's touch had become a woman who understood that love wasn't about perfection, but about acceptance. That family wasn't about blood, but about choice, and that sometimes the most broken among us can build the strongest bonds of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.